Red Bull has been more keen than the Renault Works team or McLaren with running Renault's latest Spec C engine of late, seemingly because they'll take any performance gains even with a reliability risk. But now the talk ahead of the Russian Grand Prix is that Red Bull want to add the old Spec B engine back into their engine pool, and they're prepared to take grid penalties at Sochi to do that. I'm here with Ed Straw and Stuart Codling to discuss what's behind this and maybe what to expect from Red Bull over the rest of the F1 season. Now, Codders, you were in Singapore recently and you were up close with what Red Bull are up to. It was a good weekend for the team. But then towards the end of the weekend, we started picking up these hints about grid penalties and what's behind the thinking of taking the older engine for Russia.
The issue surrounds that Spec C engine, as you say. They took it on when the other teams were a little bit worried about its long-term durability and also whether it would be able to deliver that performance uplift throughout the whole period of its life. That was the main issue that the other teams had with it. But as you say, Red Bull wanted that performance uplift because they wanted more power. Unfortunately, at Singapore, the lack of development of that engine's mapping relative to the others really manifested itself, and in the hot, humid, dense atmosphere, it started to not quite misfire slightly, but it was not delivering the torque output that was expected. And when the torque output sort of dropped unexpectedly, it caused the gearbox to go into a sort of false neutral, which is it's programmed to protect it from engine failure. So you got these inconsistent stutterings in performance. We saw Max Verstappen miss out on pole because he had, or potentially miss out on pole because he hit a false neutral. And that's all because the moisture content in the air was just affecting the way the fuel combusted inside the engine. And the worry is that going forward, particularly in Mexico, where Red Bull they think they've got a realistic chance of winning that race, the fear is that there could be unintended consequences in Mexico as well, which is at high altitude and the air's much thinner. And without more running in the dyno, they really don't know what will happen there. So by bringing a Spec B engine into the pool, it enables them to possibly carry on with that strategy of targeting the win in Mexico at the expense of short-term pain at another race. They've decided that another race is going to be Sochi, probably because they think they're in with a better chance of racing for a competitive position in Austin rather than Sochi, so they're going to take it there.
Ed, that all seems to make sense. Now, Connor's mentioned Mexico there. Everybody talks about Monaco, Hungary and Singapore being the races that Red Bull can target each year because of its power deficit. But all year, even before Monaco, Max Verstappen has always added Mexico onto that list. What is it about Mexico that has got Max and Red Bull so excited, beyond the fact that he won there last year after a bit of a mix-up at the first corner with the leaders?
Well, as Codder's mentioned, the high altitude there, 2,200 metres, Mexico City, so it is thinner air. So firstly, Red Bull feel that means the engine power disadvantage is slightly reduced, and also it's a bit more of a battle for downforce. The air is thinner. That's one of the parts of the equation for downforce. So you
see the teams pile on the downforce.
Exactly, they pile on high downforce configurations, but the actual levels of downforce they're getting is more akin to Monza than anywhere else because of this. So the Red Bull is a strong chassis, so they'll fancy their chances there. I think last year Verstappen was within a tenth of pole, whereas the race either side of it was a much bigger disadvantage. So yeah, they do see Mexico as a place where they've got a shot.
They're at least going to be in the mix there. Now, early in the year, we did have Red Bull able to win some races, partly through good fortune, but also because they were suddenly close enough to Mercedes and Ferrari. They're putting the pressure on. They were in position when there were perhaps strategic variances or slip-ups from the top teams. But other than what we've seen in Singapore, which is a strange circuit, if anything, they've dropped off a bit over either side of the summer break, you could say. Is that because Ferrari and Mercedes have just pushed each other on in their championship battle out of Red Bull's league, or is it engine development? What do you think has kind of left Red Bull? Sometimes we talk about Class A and Class B in F1, but Red Bull have almost slipped at some races into a kind of a Class A2, haven't they?
You're not wrong, and it is an interesting question because when you throw forward to 2019, we do have different aerodynamic regulations coming, so that gives the teams a little bit of a dilemma almost in terms of where they put their resources. Do they carry on targeting a championship challenge, or do they focus on next year in the hope that they can steal a march on the opposition? If if you look back to 2009, when the last sort of really major rule set happened with aerodynamic changes, because Ferrari and McLaren had spent the previous season at each other's throats, they'd neglected onward development. You saw a completely different set of teams who'd made an early jump to the new regulations all of a sudden come to the fore.
What do you reckon, Ed? You know the way Adrian Newey's mind works. Perhaps you've followed it closer than many people do. You always keep an eye on what Red Bull are up to from an aerodynamic standpoint, and you're one of our correspondents who deals the most with Gary Anderson, our technical expert. Would you expect that maybe Red Bull has shifted its focus a little bit to next year?
They'll already be well into next year's car, and they will have made sure that given there's some changes, even though they're not massive, it's significant in terms of what you're doing with the air rather than trying to outwash it around the tyres, that you're having to take more inside now. So that is quite significant, and that has downstream effects on the car. So there's no question I'll be looking at that. I think the first order thing though is the engine development up front for Mercedes and Ferrari, because if you look at it, all three of the Renault powered teams, Red Bull, McLaren and Renault, have all struggled. It's probably overstating it to say they're moving kind of backwards in lockstep, but there's enough of a trend there to say, yeah, the Renault is the first order thing. The Red Bull is still a cracking car. It looks great on track. I'm sure if we went back to Monaco tomorrow, they'd be the fastest there again, just as they were earlier this year. So I think that's the reality for Red Bull. The engine war is the number one thing, and they will have half an eye on next season, but I don't think that they've written off this year just to focus on next year by any stretch of the imagination.
There have been some mutterings from some of the customer Renault drivers that they feel that Mercedes and Ferrari development has very much outpaced them, and also a few little rumblings that Honda is now, if not alongside, certainly breathing down their neck.
And also the question of the fuel and lubricant supply difference between Red Bull and the Works Renault team, and the difficulty of getting dyno time, etc. So that maybe holds back Red Bull a little bit more in terms of getting the most out of the Renault engine.